we can't make you co-host.
Okay, I
Unless
see.
Jeannie,
Okay. Who's launched the recording?
right, but Jeannie, can you make sure that Osman can share his
screen?
PowerPoint?
Yes, and I think if I do this and I do this,
Yeah.
and I
Right, yeah.
now you should.
Here
Yeah,
you
we
are.
got it.
Yeah. Okay, good. Right. Okay, so Osman, just some logistics. I'm going to share the this presentation, and I'm going to introduce you. Do you want me to say something specific during my introduction?
No, I'm sure what you have is fine.
Okay. Yeah, I've got your page, your pen page on
Okay,
in front of
great.
me.
Thank you.
And also, I will have to leave at 3:30.
Okay.
So it leaves some time for the. How long do you expect your presentation to be?
Probably about 40 minutes or so, and then
Yeah, that's
maybe
good.
yeah,
Enough. Yeah, that's enough.
30 minutes.
Generally we aim at an hour and an hour 15 minutes.
Okay, that's
So,
perfect.
beyond that, I mean, people start to leave and
No, that's fine because I have to go into the office after this. So
yeah, and so do I actually.
Yeah.
So we should aim at,
So-
3:15 should be, yeah.
Yeah.
and I have my email address and all the contact at the end of the presentation. So if there's any follow-up, I'm happy to.
Okay. So what time did I say? Did I say 3:30? It's going to be 3:15 for me. So
Yeah,
it'll be
3:15. Yeah, 3:15
yeah.
is fine for I have to go as well, and Osman as well. So
3:15 CET.
yeah.
It's on our
Yeah,
side
yeah.
of the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
Push.
And the recording is on, and yeah, once you introduce Osman, I'll just say a few words.
Okay.
Because we'll tailor the recording obviously when it starts.
Yeah.
For real.
Or do you want to introduce the webinar series first, Judith, and then I introduce Osman?
If you want.
Yeah, we can do that.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's wait for a couple of minutes more.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is another one who sends his apologies. It's I don't know if you know him, Paolo Boccani. You know Paolo Osman? Do you know him? No.
I'm not sure.
Oh, yeah. He was also wanted to attend, and he will look at the recording as well. He's based at the Trento University in Italy.
I think I may have corresponded with him. I think he's doing some similar work and putting together a blog, maybe, or maybe.
Yeah, he had a research program on homing.
Yes.
Yeah, and the book is just out as well. On home and homing, and he's been very active on the network as well, on Thanatic Ethics network, and so you can also find a lot of the activities and the conferences, etc., on the website.
Great.
So maybe we should start.
Okay.
Yeah.
Welcome everyone. So maybe Judith, do you want to start and present the series?
Well, just to say welcome to everyone. And I know these webinars do have a long afterlife. So even if not many people are connected for the moment, it will all be online, and so the conversation will be recorded, and everything will be accessible. So as you know, this is part of the Thanatic Ethics network that originated in 2020 now, with Vidisha Banerjee at the Education University of Hong Kong, Thomas Lacroix, Sciences Po Paris, and myself at the University Paul Valéry Montpellier 3 in France as well. And so this is part of the webinar series, and we have 3 webinars this semester, and all 3 webinars actually present or introduce, an author and their works as well. So there is a book, each time. So so you'll hear, more about this. And before Thomas actually introduces Osman Balkan, who is going to be our speaker today, I also want to say something, because this is also a day that was marked by the death of Robert Badinter. And so we heard, about this in the morning. And so this is, I mean, it's another 9th of February. So which has been, quite important in his life as well. So just because of his work on, justice and accountability, and all that he has done as a lawyer and as a statesman as well. So I just want to pay my and our respects. So as we say in the Caribbean, respect. So this is just to, open the webinar as well, and it is issues we're all concerned with.
Thank you,
Thomas?
Judith. Right, so I'll say a few words just to introduce our speakers today. Osman, it's a real pleasure to have you with us. As you know, Thanatic Ethic is a program which is interested in death and migration, and obviously you are one of the key person working on this issue for a long time. But Osman, you are an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. And you're also the Associate Director of the Huntsman Program in International Studies and Business. And you've got an extensive research and teaching focus on the politics of global migration, race, ethnicity, identity, inequality, and political violence. And you published a series of books and papers on the questions of death, of body repatriation, and more specifically, you're going to talk about that, I suppose. You published recently a book which is Dying Abroad: The Political Afterlives of Migration in Europe. Osman, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, very well.
Yes, perfect. Well, thank you for that warm introduction, and it's a distinct pleasure to be able to present this research to the Thanatic Ethics group. I've been following your activities for many years, and I'm really grateful for your effort in pushing these conversations forward and bringing into focus some of the important issues surrounding migration, death, and questions of home and belonging. So thank you very much for having me, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to the folks tuning in from all around the world. It's a pleasure to be here. As Thomas mentioned, the base of my talk today is a book that I've recently published called Dying Abroad: The Political Afterlives of Migration in Europe, which came out as part of the LSE International Studies series at Cambridge University Press. And this series prioritizes transdisciplinary approaches to international and transnational politics. And the book offers an ethnographic account of the complexities of death, dying, and burial in migratory settings, and analyzes the role that end-of-life practices play in the negotiation of social, political, and cultural boundaries. My primary focus is on Muslims of Turkish and Kurdish descent in Germany, whose posthumous predicaments resonate with other minoritized communities in Western Europe and beyond. Now, in spite of the great diversity of migratory origins, trajectories, and destinations, I see important commonalities in the experience of what I refer to in the book as death out of place, that speak to the ambivalent nature of home and belonging in an increasingly globalized world. And with the term death out of place, I'm trying to capture something that is shared by immigrant and minority families, confronting difficult end-of-life decisions in countries where they face structural barriers to political inclusion and equal social standing. And as I hope to show you today, how families navigate this complicated terrain offers insight into the stakes of membership in national and religious communities, the scope of sovereign power and authority, and the antinomies of citizenship and identity in contemporary multicultural societies. Now, as many of you probably remember, the complications and contradictions of death and dying in the context of international migration became the subject of newspaper headlines during the early months of the coronavirus pandemic, as governments across the world imposed lockdowns and border closures to mitigate the spread of the virus. Numerous states enacted travel restrictions on both the living and the dead, suspending cross-border travel as well as the cross-border repatriation of human remains. These decisions left many people in distress, especially those who were unable to carry out a family member's dying wishes to be buried in ancestral lands. But the newspaper headlines also drew attention to the severe shortage of burial grounds for religious minorities in countries of settlement. So in France, a country with nearly 6 million Muslims, for example, less than 2% of its 35,000 municipal burial grounds have spaces dedicated for Islamic burials. In Germany, which was where I did most of my research, this figure is less than 1% of all cemeteries. And although the newspaper headlines may have given readers the impression that the burial dilemmas they spoke to were a product of the pandemic, in fact, they were long-standing concerns for minority communities. Perennial questions about the meaning of home and homeland take on a particular gravitas in death, especially for immigrants and their children. Moreover, the question of what is to be done with a loved one's mortal remains assumes greater urgency when cultural or religious traditions prohibit cremation and mandate burial in perpetuity. So in other words, when bodies are expected to remain intact and in one place. The act of burial confers a sense of fixity to identities that are more fluid or ambivalent in life. It's a means to assert belonging, attachment, and perhaps even loyalty to a particular country, community, or place. And when the boundaries of a nation and its members are contested, burial decisions are political acts. But such decisions unfold within a myriad of overlapping and sometimes conflicting political institutions and cultural value systems. They involve a range of formal actors and informal networks. My book starts from the premise that death and the rituals surrounding it provide an important window into the socioeconomic and political orders and hierarchies that structure human life in the 21st century. I argue that states, families, and religious communities all have a vested interest in the fate of dead bodies, including where and how they are buried and commemorated. Further, I show that end-of-life practices are connected to broader political struggles over the boundaries of nation-states and the place of minoritized groups within them. Local burial in countries of settlement offers a symbolically powerful way for migrants and their children to assert political membership and to foster a sense of belonging. But the widespread practice of posthumous repatriation for burial in ancestral soils illustrates both the continued importance of transnational ties and serves as an indictment of exclusionary socio-political orders. And in both situations, the corpse is central to localizing and grounding claims, political claims for recognition. And at times, this can be a very contentious process where different actors clash over where dead bodies should go and what they might signify. Those who experience death out of place may face barriers to belonging in both the countries where they live and in those where they are purportedly from. And how they attempt to resolve these contradictions in both life and in death reveals both the profound importance and the fundamental ambiguity of the meaning of home and homeland for transnational migrants and their kin. Now, this ambiguity is reflected in my own usage of the qualified and admittedly awkward phrase Muslims of Turkish and Kurdish descent in Germany to describe my interlocutors. Well, it would be misleading, I think, to characterize these communities as immigrants, given that several generational cohorts who were born in Germany and hold German citizenship, like other minoritized and racialized populations, such as the descendants of Caribbean and South Asian migrants in Britain, North Africans in France, Muslims of Turkish and Kurdish descent in Germany remain outside of dominant national imaginaries. And in a political climate marked by rising xenophobia, national chauvinism, and anti-Muslim racism, the phrase Muslims of Turkish and Kurdish descent is meant to underscore a fundamental tension at the heart of public debates surrounding immigration, race, religion, and identity in Europe today. As other scholars have observed, and here's just an image with some of the books that influenced my own thinking on issues surrounding race and migration in Europe and North America. So as other scholars have observed, such qualifiers are an effect of what many believe to be the incommensurability of categories such as German and Muslim or Muslim and European. Similar to what Lisa Lowe has indexed with reference to Asian Americans in the United States, Muslims in Germany are seen by many Germans as perpetual immigrants, eternal newcomers, or as the foreigner within. Now, given this context, I sought to better understand how Muslim communities in Germany managed and made sense of death and dying in a country where they did not always feel at home. Adopting an ethnographic approach, I conducted 15 discontinuous months of field work in Berlin and Istanbul between 2013 and 2017. In Germany, I studied the evolution of the Islamic funeral industry, working alongside Muslim undertakers at several Islamic funeral homes and participating in every aspect of their day-to-day work. I assisted them in funeral ceremonies, helping to transport and bury deceased Muslims at a number of different cemeteries in Berlin. Together, we also prepared corpses for international repatriation and delivered them to Berlin area airports for shipment on cargo and commercial flights. During my research, I also visited dozens of cemeteries in Germany and several other European countries to learn about patterns of posthumous memorialization. I photographed more than 1,000 tombstones in Germany, Belgium, Spain, Sweden, and the Netherlands to create a visual ethnographic archive of the physical landscapes of burial and commemoration, what I refer to as Europe's Islamic deathscapes. I also conducted semi-structured interviews with bereaved families, government officials, religious leaders, medical practitioners, and representatives of Islamic funeral funds, all in an effort to better understand the role that end-of-life practices play in the negotiation of social, political, and cultural boundaries. And alongside these formal interviews, I had countless informal conversations with community members during visits to ethnic and cultural associations, youth centers, mosques, restaurants, and cafes, which ultimately helped shape the direction that my research took. In Turkey, I spent 3 months conducting fieldwork in Istanbul to learn more about the receiving end of the repatriation process. I was able to interview municipal cemetery administrators and to accompany undertakers to the airport to pick up bodies that had been shipped from overseas. I also attended and observed several funeral ceremonies and visited nearly a dozen municipal cemeteries to try to better understand differences in funerary rituals and memorialization practices. And while I won't go into it right now, I'm also happy to address questions of my own positionality and strategies for conducting field work in the Q&A if anyone is interested in methodological issues connected to ethnographic and qualitative research. But in the time I have remaining, let me try to walk you through my book and its arguments. The first half of the book focuses on the legal, institutional, and economic aspects of death out of place, or what might be termed, what might be understood as the material conditions of death, burial, and end-of-life care in migratory settings. So the chapter 1 examines the work of Islamic funeral funds in Europe, which provide logistical and financial support for the cross-border transportation of Muslim corpses. These institutions emerged in tandem with the aging of the first generation of Muslim immigrants in Western Europe in the 1990s and the growing need for culturally and religiously appropriate funerary services. So my focus is on two of the largest and most important Islamic funeral funds in Europe, whose combined membership across the continent is nearly 500,000 members. These funds are administered by two long-standing Turkish Islamic civil society associations, who, in addition to providing funerary services, offer a wide range of religious, educational, and cultural services, such as the organization of Hajj pilgrimages and Eid celebrations, as well as Quran courses, language training, and professional education. Drawing on interviews with fund administrators and close readings of primary sources such as promotional literature, such as the ads you see here, and membership contracts, I examined the strategies and practices through which these organizations institutionalize, incentivize, and justify posthumous repatriation for burial. I argue that by incentivizing cross-border repatriation, they affirm the symbolic connection between the dead body and the nation and help legitimize the idea that the dead belong in a particular place, engaging in a form of what I call necropatriotism. So you see here the two ads, the one on the left side of the screen that with the tree in the photo, is an ad by DİTİB, which is an Islamic funeral fund that is connected to the Turkish Ministry of Religious Affairs in Europe. And the ad reads that, you know, with more than 200,000 members, have you not yet become a member of DİTİB's funeral fund? Because if you haven't, you should go ahead and hurry up and do so, because death does not arrive when it is going to, death does not announce when it is going to arrive. Excuse me. The one on the right with the white background says, on your most painful days, we are by your side. This one is UKBA, which is a fund connected to the group Milli Görüş in Germany, and at the bottom you can see, you know, the kind of stylized version of some of the services they provide, including, you know, taking care of the formal paperwork, transport, religious rituals, hospital visits, grave visits, and so on. So there is some important variation in the different funds, and there's at least a dozen of these such funds that are operating in Germany. I chose these were the two largest. But basically, I looked at some of their membership literature, their contracts, some of their founding documents. So here's a quote from one of the founding documents of DİTİB, which reads as follows. Established in 1992 to provide a lasting, practical, and secure solution to the serious problem faced by our people who, having spent a lifetime in gurbet, which is a Turkish word that is slightly difficult to translate in English, but it means something like a melancholic exile, I would say. So who, having spent a lifetime in gurbet and out of a longing for their homeland, desire to have their bodies repatriated to our country for burial. In a very short time, this fund has provided for the mutual support and solidarity desired amongst our citizens, and has been the object of great interest and respect. So this is from the mission statement of the DİTİB Funeral Fund. So I did try to collect some empirical data on, you know, burial outcomes of fund members. Some of these funeral funds used to post their activities online, posting numbers about how many fund members were buried locally versus repatriated. And sometimes these are announced in letters to membership that go out at the end of the year with their annual due fees. So my data on this is a bit scattered, but just to show you from 2 years that I was able to find some information from 2011 and 2013. These are the burial outcomes of fund members of DITIB's funeral funds. As you can see, the vast majority of fund members are repatriated for burial. And this has to do with a lot of different reasons, including the fact that at the time, the fund did not subsidize the cost of burial in Germany. They would not pay for a burial plot, but there are other reasons which I'll get to in a bit. So moving on, though, the funeral funds were one of the important actors that I was looking at to understand the institutionalization of Islamic burial in Germany. The second half of the book focuses on Muslim undertakers, as well as the bureaucracy of death and the Islamic funeral industry in Germany. So as I mentioned before, my ethnographic research included participant observation with several Islamic funeral homes in Berlin. Here's an image of a storefront of one of the funeral homes that's located in the neighborhood of Neukölln. During my field work, I attended, observed, and took part in all aspects of their work, from preparing bodies for burial to burying bodies locally and preparing them for international repatriation. And here are some images that I took with a body that's being loaded for shipment on a commercial flight at Berlin's Schönefeld airport. I should point out that in many Muslim majority countries, funerary services are part of the welfare state, and funerals are typically conducted within 24 hours of an individual's death. So the establishment of a private market for Islamic funerals in Germany is really a novel consequence of migration. Here's one of the undertakers who I interviewed during my research. So I came to understand that the work of undertaking takes on political salience in multicultural societies where different ethnic and religious groups have divergent views on death and dying, end-of-life care, and the proper treatment of corpses. In situations where there is some uncertainty about funerary traditions and burial laws, undertakers play a critical role in guiding families through the religious, political, and legal landscapes that structure the transitions from life to death. The undertakers that I observed served as political and cultural intermediaries between Muslim communities and the German state in two important ways. First, they helped socialize their customers to the norms and values underlying the German legal rational order and its associated expectations. The bureaucracy of death functions not only as an institution that is particularly emblematic of such an order, but also reflects a broader sociocultural structure with associated attitudes, mannerisms, dispositions, and sensibilities. In other words, the bureaucracy of death reflects a particular way of being properly German or properly integrated. I'll get to this point in a moment. Second, the Muslims, undertakers offered lessons about Muslim citizens to the German state by countering derogatory stereotypes about Islam and Muslims in Germany. Through their daily encounters and conversations with civil servants and agents of the German bureaucracy, they sought to dispel widely held myths and negative perceptions about Islam and Muslims. When burying the dead and tending to the living, the Muslim undertakers of Berlin worked to reconcile competing and sometimes conflicting sets of administrative and cultural norms surrounding death and burial. So, for example, while Muslims believe that the deceased should be buried as soon as possible after death, usually within 24 hours, German laws require a mandatory 48-hour waiting period, which in practice can take much longer if there are concerns about the cause of death. Likewise, while Muslims believe that individuals should be buried without a coffin, just wrapped simply in a shroud, many states in Germany mandate the use of a coffin for burial. So in reconciling these and other issues, the Muslim undertakers of Berlin preside not just over end-of-life decisions and their theological implications, but over pedagogical moments of political and sociocultural integration in contemporary Germany. Their ability to navigate the regulatory structures of the German bureaucracy and the cultural expectations of their customers is both a defining feature of their occupational identity and a principal source of their professional authority. So let me give you a few examples from my interviews with the undertakers to illustrate what I have in mind. So as one undertaker who I will call Bülent told me with reference to the attitudes and expectations of his customers, he said, quote, we live in a non-Muslim, gayri-Muslim country. There are laws. We have to go to the government agencies. This isn't a village. When someone dies, you can't just bury them that afternoon. The government agencies in Germany are open in the morning and closed in the afternoon. Think about it. You need to go pick up the body from the hospital, take care of all the official procedures, and the whole system works by appointment. It's not a village. You can't just call the imam and say, let's get it over with. He went on to say, our people have been living here for 50 years. They could live here for another 150 years, and they wouldn't understand the system of the country that they live in. They don't understand the German system, nor do they want to understand it. Whatever pre-existing mentality they brought with them from Anatolia, the village mentality, it's still there, end quote. I should point out that the trope of the Anatolian village was a kind of a recurring, discursive move that came out in a lot of my interviews that basically stood in for a kind of a pre-modern or an integrated mentality. And I'll come back to that too. So for Bülent and the other undertakers, the bureaucracy is an inescapable aspect of their day-to-day work. It's at once a source of frustration, but also the basis of their authority. Although they're impeded by the endless amount of paperwork and the difficulty of coordinating across a myriad of different governmental agencies, they are committed to the logic and practice of the bureaucratic order. Their ability to navigate the intricacies of the bureaucracy of death is intrinsic to their role as cultural mediators and is a central feature of their occupational identity and expertise. So mastery or know-how of the logic of bureaucracy furnishes individuals with a type of cultural capital that can be used as a resource in pursuit of economic gain. And to be fair, the bureaucracy of death in Germany is quite complex. So Mehmet, another undertaker, described to me the steps leading up between a person's death and burial. So he said, quote, in some municipalities, the Standesamt are closed on Wednesdays and Fridays. We can't do anything on those days. And on Thursdays, they are only open in the afternoon after 2 p.m. So if you have a death on a Tuesday and you want to repatriate the body, the earliest it will go is the following Monday, because the Standesamt is closed on Wednesday. On Thursday, it opens at 2 p.m. By the time I'm finished there, the consulate is closed. On Friday, the Standesamt is closed, and everything is closed over the weekend, so it has to wait until Monday. But if someone dies on a Monday, we can usually ship the body the next day without all of these problems. So as you see, the kind of Kafkaesque bureaucracy and the challenges of, the certain variation in the opening hours and closing hours and the endless amount of offices that they have to visit in order to furnish the proper paperwork in order to proceed with the burial or the repatriation. But what I found compelling in the undertaker's stories is how they were personally imbricated in the reproduction of a bureaucratized vision of socio-political life. So in mediating encounters between minority citizens and the state, they help translate and disseminate political norms and also work to enforce them. In this sense, the work of undertaking is not simply a matter of burying bodies. In their interactions with customers, the Muslim undertakers of Berlin preside over pedagogical moments of political and socio-cultural integration in Germany. And as I mentioned earlier, the mediating role that they play is multidirectional. So remember that they work not only with minority communities, but with state officials as well. So in the course of their day-to-day tasks, they have numerous interactions with German bureaucrats at a number of different venues, and also work hand in hand with various agencies and agents of the German state. So another dimension of their mediating role involves combating negative stereotypes about Muslims in Germany. By presenting themselves as responsible, professional, well-integrated, knowledgeable individuals, Muslim undertakers attempt to demystify popular assumptions and misconceptions about Islam and Muslims in Germany. In some cases, they take on the role of a spokesperson and pedagogue willingly, but in others, they find themselves in a position where they feel compelled to speak on behalf of others. So one undertaker, who I'll call Ismail, explained it to me in the following terms. He said, quote, "I teach a lot of classes in hospitals and police stations about the things that people should pay attention to when there is a dying Muslim. Since 9/11, people in Germany get a little uneasy when they hear the word Muslim. I try to alleviate those fears in my classes. Germans are really afraid of Muslims," he continued. "After those events in the US, they are even more afraid. When someone says Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, the Germans will look around and say, 'What's going on here? Is there a bomb?' In the courses I teach, I try to take away this fear," says Ismail. So for him, negative stereotypes about Muslims in Germany are pervasive and have only been heightened in the post 9/11 era. He sees a need to correct unfavorable ideas about Muslims by educating those who have regular contact with Muslims in their line of work. So one technique he employs is explicitly pedagogical. By visiting hospitals and speaking with staff members, his goal is to educate them about Islamic death rites and rituals so that they can provide proper end-of-life care. Another strategy involves his own appearance and self-presentation. So he told me that most people who visit my funeral home expect to see a bearded man, a hoca, which is kind of like a Turkish slang for an ostentatious religious figure. When they see me, they are surprised. They ask me, "Wait, you're a Muslim?" Because they were expecting someone with a big beard. So he expresses a certain pleasure in this kind of misrecognition by not conforming to the expected image of what a Muslim undertaker should look like. He challenges preconceptions about what Muslims should look like. So in embodying and presenting an alternative Islamic identity, Ismail hopes to dispel some of the myths that circulate in the German public sphere. Now, as an undertaker, he doesn't represent any particular group or community, but he willingly embraces the role of a public figure with a political mission. And in challenging expectations about Muslims in Germany, he provides a type of corrective cultural mediation. And I'm happy to say more about the undertakers in the Q&A. But now let me move on to the second half of my book, which examines the symbolic and cultural dimensions of death, dying, and burial in migratory context. In these chapters, I'm particularly interested in processes of placemaking and identity construction, evident in the rituals and ceremonies accompanying acts of burial and memorialization. So the third chapter of the book offers a visual ethnography of Islamic burial grounds in Europe and focuses on representations of religious, ethnic, and national identities on the tombstones of Muslim graves. Here, I illustrate the central role that cemeteries play in the construction of diasporic memory and collective identity by analyzing tombstones located at several Islamic burial grounds in Germany and other Western European countries. Now, as I mentioned earlier, in spite of the long-term settlement of Muslims in Europe, Islamic cemeteries are still extremely rare. Here's an image that I took. This is at the entrance to the Islamic burial ground in Berlin's Gotthard-Spandau Cemetery. And as you see, the plaque here has multilingual signage in German, Turkish, and Arabic, and the year of its consecration, 1988. This is one of the main cemeteries that still has burial plots available for Muslims in the Berlin area. So I spent a lot of time here. But in Germany, overall, less than 1% of the country's approximately 32,000 burial grounds have dedicated spaces for Muslims. Though they are uncommon, these spaces are suffused with deep cultural meaning as places where the physical landscape is symbolically inscribed and re-signified. Islamic burial grounds offer insight into the changing contours of political membership and identity in an increasingly multicultural European space. They are places where ethno-religious minorities assert their long-term presence. And in doing so, they help normalize symbols of national, religious, and linguistic diversity in contemporary Europe. So to show you a few examples, of the type of things that caught my eye. Graves are marked as Islamic through the use of religious epitaphs such as Ruhuna Fatiha or simply Fatiha, a reference to the first chapter of the Quran and an injunction for passers-by to pray for the souls of the deceased. The act of writing Fatiha on a tombstone not only marks the individual deceased as a Muslim, but also situates her within the broader collective Islamic community by instigating communicative action between the deceased and other members of the Muslim community. The Fatiha signals the existence of a Muslim identity while simultaneously entreating other Muslims to profess and perform their own Islamic identities through ritualistic acts of prayer. By acknowledging the deceased as Muslim and by praying for the souls of all Muslims, the observant visitor to an Islamic cemetery reflexively produces the wider Islamic community through pious symbolic action. Now, perhaps it's unsurprising that Muslim graves would utilize religious language in memorializing an individual, since the practice is quite common across other religious faiths too, such as Christian graves that evoke Jesus Christ or salvation. What I found more surprising was the presence of national flags and tombstones shaped like mosques, which I'll come to in a moment. So with the flags here, in places where commemorative practices are more explicitly shaped by the state, like military cemeteries or memorials to soldier dead or the tombs of unknown soldiers, the utilization of national flags on or near tombstones is perhaps a calculated strategy to bolster patriotic sentiment. It also serves as a reminder of the state's sovereignty, its power over life and death. How then might we interpret the fact that the flags marking Europe's Muslim dead are affixed not to the graves of soldiers and statesmen, but rather to the tombstones of ordinary civilians? These private acts of commemoration nationalize the dead and situate them within a particular political community. They can be read as symbols of real or aspirational patriotism, but whether or not the individual in question actually harbored strong patriotic sentiments is, in my view, less important than the message conveyed by the existence of a flag on a tombstone, which links the dead to a specific country. Now, the flag is a recognizable visual marker that has the potential to reach a wider audience than an epitaph or inscription, particularly if the text of these is written in a language that is unintelligible to the observer. And many graves did have text that was written in sort of non-German languages. So flags are powerful symbols of national belonging that communicate a range of emotional attachments to nation states and political communities. In minority burial grounds, however, the flag of a foreign country sends a strong and potentially paradoxical message to visitors to the cemetery. Like the common practice of indicating a foreign birthplace, the flag's presence on a tombstone acknowledges histories of migration and signals membership in other political communities. But these graves are also a testament to the fact that repatriation was not pursued, right? So these are flags on tombstones of graves located in Germany, right? So finally, a peculiar and innovative grave form that I observed in Islamic cemeteries across Europe was the mosque grave. The mosque graves transform the landscape of European cemeteries by imbuing them with new religious iconography. They are a stunning example of what art historian Christy Gruber has termed Islamic architecture on the move. But what sort of politics is present in the construction of mini mosques in public cemeteries? As I read it, the use of Islamic architectural elements like the mosque grave is in part a response to the social and political challenges faced by Muslim communities across Europe. In recent decades, the visibility of Islamic symbols in the European public sphere, such as the headscarf or the mosque, has generated much political controversy. Efforts to build actual mosques and sites of worship have been undermined by those who see the presence of Islamic buildings as a threat to the purportedly secular landscape of the European public sphere. So the incorporation of religious architecture and design in the public space of the cemetery might be understood as one strategy through which Muslim communities across the continent express their religious faith, and represents also an innovative step towards the normalization of Islamic symbols in the European landscape. Just as Muslim tombstones may display features of syncretism and assimilation to dominant cultures, they also showcase the ways in which Islamic elements become subtly incorporated into the urban fabric. And rather than assuming that the expression of national, ethnic, or religious affiliation is simply evidence of cultural retention or communalism, I think it's helpful to understand such gestures as evidence of the changing nature of European identity. Read in this light, expressions of Islam in places like Berlin, Brussels, or Stockholm are not instantiations of an outside, extraneous, or foreign culture. They are reflections of an evolving and dynamic multicultural and multi-confessional society. While mosques and minarets might currently seem out of place in the cemetery or in the city, their proliferation has the potential to neutralize their effect. In the future, they might be just as unremarkable as the crosses and church towers that are an integral part of Europe's urban landscape. By burying their dead in Germany and elsewhere in Europe, ethnic and religious minorities claim European soils as their own. Though their tombstones might display markers of alterity, their corpses attest to the fact that they are here to stay. So, having taken you on a brief tour of Islamic deathscapes, let me turn now to the fourth and final section of my book, which investigates the different factors that influence family decisions about where to bury their loved ones and the significance they ascribe to the location of burial. And I do see something in the chat. Is that something I should look at now, or shall I just continue? Oh, okay, just a message there. Okay.
You can finish your presentation and then we'll shift to the Q&A.
Okay, thank you. So this is the last part of the presentation. Thank you for your patience. This is the last chapter of my book, which looks at the different reasons why families justified local burial versus repatriation, and the significance that they ascribe to these choices. So in reflecting and explaining their own preferences and in reflecting on the decisions of others, my interview partners emphasize the role of the family, the significance of territory and soil, and one's own structural position within German society as the most important factors influencing burial outcomes. So these factors lend credence to my interviewees' attachments to Turkey and Germany, and were central in their narratives about the significance of life, death, and burial in the context of migration. So let me share with you a few quotes from my interviews to show you what I have in mind here. So corporeal assertions of the body, corporeal assertions of belonging deploy the body as an anchor. In some cases, the dead were anchored by their children. So as one elderly woman that I interviewed at a retirement home told me that, quote, "When I die, I want to be buried here. My children are here." A man that I interviewed at a Kurdish cultural center expressed concern that no one would honor his memory by visiting his grave if he were repatriated for burial. The villages are empty, he told me. If you're buried in Germany, someone can visit you every week or on holidays. They can leave some flowers on your grave, or at the very least, they can come and look at it. And just as future generations anchor the dead can anchor future generations. So some of my respondents thought that repatriation was preferable to local burial because it would encourage the children and grandchildren of the deceased to maintain some sort of emotional connection to their ancestral soils. So a retired Turkish nurse who came to Germany as a young child told me that her husband, quote, "wants to be buried in his homeland, so our children visit him and maintain ties to Turkey." Now, although she herself wanted to be buried in Germany, she wondered whether it would be better to be buried alongside her husband for the sake of their children. When you become a mother or a father, she told me with a smile, you think of your children even after death. Two Alevi religious leaders that I spoke to also emphasized the importance of maintaining intergenerational connections to ancestral lands through the practice of repatriation for burial. So during our lengthy conversation, they stressed the importance of land, soil, and historical memory. Our graves are our genealogical records, one of them said. I know my great-great-grandfather's grave. For me, this is history. I don't have to ask anyone. I can go there and see 200, 250 years of history, and my child sees it too. For him, the grave is an important reference point, and for us Alevis, this is very important. So the village cemeteries in Turkey thus served as an important referent for Alevis in the diaspora, offering material proof of their history and genealogy. These leaders supported the repatriation precisely because it helped preserve historical memory and genealogical continuity within a migratory context. And while different ideas about family and communal continuity result in different burial outcomes, among all of my interview partners, there was a recognition that the dead anchor the living, by conferring historical depth and significance to particular places. And when articulating why they thought it was important to maintain these ties and connections, some of my interview partners invoked the centrality of the physical landscape. Quote, the mountains, the soil, the air, and water are completely different. You even miss the stones. A Turkish woman in her 50s who had emigrated to Berlin as a child told me in justifying her decision to be repatriated for burial. Another interviewee, an elderly Kurdish man, recounted that, quote, the soil is honor and wealth. It means everything. In describing why he wanted to be buried in his familial village, he reasoned that, quote, I was born in that soil and I will return to it. That's my own view, at least. That's why I was born. Sometimes my wife will tell me, hey, let's get buried here in Germany if that's what our kids want. But I say, forget it. Bring us back to the homeland. When I die, I want to be brought back to the homeland so that when I rot, when I'm eaten, it's the bugs and the ants from my village that eat me. That's what I always say. Some of my respondents viewed the decision to be buried in Germany as a coming to terms with the decades-long process of settlement and integration. So one of my informants, a Kurdish man in his 40s who organizes funerals for the Kurdish community in Berlin and has been living in Germany for more than 15 years, told me with reference to the third generation that, quote, they are here for good. God forbid, but when they die, they are buried here. This proves that they are here to stay. They aren't immigrants. They are permanent members of this society. But others felt quite differently. One of my interview partners, a successful entrepreneur in his early 40s who owns and operates a series of restaurants in Berlin, told me that our soil is there in Turkey. I want to be buried there too. I grew up here in Germany, but this is not our soil. We live here, we do everything here, but this place never fully accepted us and it never will. It's impossible, really impossible. That's why we'll always remain foreigners. So what's the point of being buried in a foreign country? And here you see how the link between social exclusion and the desire for posthumous repatriation is made explicit. Stating that it's impossible for him to be fully accepted in German society, he seeks refuge in a soil over which he claims ownership. In this account, social death generates a longing for belonging that can only be achieved after biological death and return to natal soils for burial. Another interview partner, a retired Turkish factory worker in his mid-60s, put it even more bluntly. He said, let me be honest. I've been scorned in Germany. I've been despised and disparaged. That's why I want to be buried where I was born. I have a homeland. Why should I be buried here? Whenever something happens in Germany, they always blame the Turks. My grave should be in Turkey. I'm determined. If my family wants to join me, fine. If not, it doesn't matter. I was always Auslander, a foreigner, and I don't want to be Auslander in my grave. So both these statements exemplify the potential disconnect that exists between formal legal membership through national citizenship and a sense of belonging in a political community. Experiences with racism, discrimination, or xenophobia generate feelings of perpetual foreignness, a stigma which follows individuals to the grave. Now, in such contexts, repatriation might be read as an act of defiance that signals the rejection of a political community that excludes. But on the other hand, the posthumous homecoming that is imagined in these accounts belies the profound disillusionment that can characterize return journeys. a disillusionment that grows in proportion to the gulf between nostalgia and reality. But in either case, these narratives illustrate how membership and belonging to political and national communities is structured and made meaningful through end-of-life rituals and post-mortem practices. So just to conclude, as I hope I've shown you today, while death is undoubtedly a universally shared human experience, it poses distinct challenges for minoritized communities in migratory settings. Death out of place foregrounds questions that are central to the intergenerational experience of migration. Who am I and where do I belong? For members of the Muslim minority communities who are the interlocutors of my book, the complex web of interests, institutions, and emotions that accompany the rupture of death out of place through the funeral industry and its engagement with state bureaucracy, the choice between repatriation or local burial, and the symbolic act of commemoration through a grave marker exemplifies how national identity in a transnational world is ambiguously resolved even in death, neither obviously here nor there. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Osman. Thank you for this glimpse in your very rich work. It's really fascinating, all the aspect that you addressed. Well, I got plenty of questions myself, but there is already one which popped out. Catriona, do you want to read your? I can allow you to speak if you want. Do you want to read your questions, or do you want me to do so?
I'm happy to do that if you can. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, please. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. Well, Osman, thank you so much for your presentation and for all the work that you've done in producing this really important, much needed book. We are, Last Rights is the name of our organization, and we're currently focusing on difficulties that families face, particularly migrant families face, when trying to interact with undertakers. And we're working with undertakers in various countries in Europe as well as elsewhere, but mainly in Europe at the moment. So it would be really helpful to know from your point of view, what do you think are the key issues for undertakers to be aware of and for them to ensure that they act on in order to respect rights and enable people to grieve, to mourn, to repatriate their loved ones where that's what they wish. And also, I've just mentioned our work called Everybody Counts, which you might be interested to look at another time, which is on our last website. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Catriona, for the work that you're doing, working within the community, within the professional industry. I think it's really important to have these kind of bridges, and I think there's a lot of educational work that has to be done. In particular, you know. For Muslim communities, which, I mean, these are the communities I work most closely with, there is this expectation and desire that the body should be buried as quickly as possible after death. And that's owing to the idea that the body is still sentient, right? That it continues to feel pain until it is put into the earth. So one of the challenges that the undertakers spoke to me about with respect to their customers was the temporal challenge. So the expectation that after the death, that as quickly as possible that the body would be buried. And often, as I was outlining some of the bureaucratic procedures, it can take quite a bit of time to achieve in practice. So it could take, you know, a week or so even. And this is true with repatriation too. Although one interesting finding from my research is that families, I found, were more willing to suspend the kind of temporal injunction of a quick burial if the body was being repatriated and they understood that it was going back to the proper place. So in some senses, the religious injunction can be a little more flexible than could be commonly assumed. But I think one thing that undertakers ought to know about is this temporal injunction that might be quite relevant and important for certain pious families, and to better understand, what they may read as a kind of impatience or lack of understanding or cooperation with the sort of bureaucratic rules might actually be coming from a place of religious belief. So I think this is an important point to be made aware. Also, with respect to the burial traditions, shroud burial versus coffin burial, I mean, cemetery laws differ amongst different countries in Europe, where some are more flexible. Within Germany, in fact, shroud burial is allowed, but in some states, but there are some further bureaucratic complications. So the notion that an individual ought to be buried with a coffin might come as a surprise to some Muslim customers of the undertakers, right, who were expecting something along the lines of the traditions that they're used to in ancestral lands. And finally, another thing to be aware of, I think, is that for Muslims as well as for other religious communities, I mean, there is the desire to be buried in sections of cemeteries that are reserved for members of the faith, right? So Islamic burial grounds are in separate areas of the cemetery, but in many cemeteries without these special sections reserved for Muslims, there are cases where Muslims are buried in Christian sections of cemeteries and Jewish sections of cemeteries, right? This may pose an issue, so I think it's important, to kind of gauge. Some community members may be more flexible about this. They might prefer a burial at a cemetery that is closer to their house, even if it doesn't have a Islamic section. And they're buried in a Christian section, let's say. But I think this is something that undertakers should be aware of. And of course, the prohibition against cremation. I think this one is pretty straightforward, but I did have conversations with some of the Muslim undertakers who told me that they would regularly receive a phone call from a municipal agency saying that they had an indigent or homeless death that they believed that was a Muslim, and would the undertakers take this case pro bono, because I think the default burial method in cases of kind of a pauper funeral, right, is cremation, which is something that you can't undo, and something that for pious Muslims would be a really bad thing to happen to them. So these are just some of the things that come to mind. I'd be happy to talk further, but I think it is important for the undertakers to have this sort of cultural awareness about different religious expectations and beliefs, just because in a moment of very difficult grieving and mourning, these kind of misunderstandings can be quite elevated and heightened, and have some, kind of emotional damage to the relationship between the undertaker and the family. So I very much appreciate your efforts in moving that conversation forward.
Thank you very
Osman.
much.
Yeah, there is, I've got myself a question. I will allow myself to ask it because I need to leave in about 10 minutes. You presented at the very beginning these two organizations, Miligoroosh and DTIB. And as you know, DTIB was created in the 80s to counter the influence of Miligoroosh, were led by opponents to the military regime. So can we understand their involvement in the management of or the provision of services for burial and repatriation as a tool for them to compete for the influence of the over the Turkish population?
Yes, I mean, so you've put your finger on a very kind of complicated local and transnational dynamic of the role of civil society associations in the diaspora, those which have closer connection or affiliation with the home government, and those which may have a more oppositional or critical stance. And so I think that there is an effort amongst the Turkish government, like many states, to maintain some kind of influence over the populations abroad, right? And this can be seen in sometimes political campaigning in Turkish elections that takes place in Europe. It can be seen, in the practice of sending imams who are trained in Turkish theological institutions to do pastoral work in Germany. And I know that, one of the conversations that's been taking place through the Deutsche Islam Conference is about the kind of greater institutionalization of theological training for imams in Germany to basically produce German-educated pastoral leaders, right? So within the space of burial and repatriation, I think that these Islamic funeral funds do compete with one another for membership. After all, they're looking to grow their membership numbers because the way that the economics of it works is that it is a annual due that people pay, and their membership fees vary by age. If you're younger, it's cheaper to become a member. And there's certain membership criteria which has undergone revision in recent years. But for example, one of the criteria during the time of my research for DİTİB's funeral fund was that you had to be a Turkish national, whereas with UKBA's fund, with the Milli Görüş fund, it was a fund that was open to all Muslims, right? So they didn't have that nationality requirement. Another difference was that the UKBA fund would cover some of the costs of local burial and countries of residence, and the DİTİB fund would not. So there were different kind of incentives through the membership contracts that I detail a bit further in the book. But I think these are associations that, as I mentioned, in addition to the burial and repatriation practices, they're also providing other forms of pastoral care, right? Hajj trips, right? Quran courses, professional language education. So this is one aspect of their portfolio, but one in which I think it is reasonable to say that there are competition among these different associations to extend their influence. And in Germany, there are at least a dozen Islamic funeral funds that are attached to various different kind of religious communities, right? Political communities with different affiliations, and they all have their membership, the services they provide are all generally the same, but in terms of membership criteria and services and kind of requirements and so on, there are some subtle differences that reflect, I think, different understandings of their role within the diasporic community and what kind of influence they wish to seek. So I think that's a whole area of important debate, which is once again reflected in the end of life issues, as well as the other issues that they're catering to for their living members. So that's an important question.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
But we have two more questions. I have one myself as well. So there is Mariana and Sid. Whoever, do you want to speak up? And we'll have time. I mean, even if Thomas has to leave, we'll have time for all the questions.
Yeah, Judith, you need to click on the blue button and allow them to speak. So yeah, otherwise they can't. Mariana, you can speak, and then
which button?
Well, Mariana, you can.
Hi. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
And Thomas, can you allow Sid as well to
Yeah,
be everyone? I mean, you know.
yeah. Well, Catriona is already on. Yeah.
Okay.
And I also activated Christina's sound.
Right.
Thank you.
Cool. Thank you, Osman, for this fascinating presentation. So my question is more methodological, specifically because I'm currently doing my PhD. I finished my fieldwork, and a large part of my PhD focuses on refugee deaths in Greece and refugee burials, specifically at the Greek-Turkish land border and in Lesbos. So I was wondering how difficult or easy was it to gain access to funerals or burials and document them visually?
Yes. So, you know, the core of my ethnography was amongst the undertakers. So I was working alongside of them. So it was through their invitations that I was able to attend some of the funerals. And, you know, it's always very sensitive. And I actually have some methodological reflections as in the book. Each chapter is open with a field note, and one of them involves my, you know, some of the challenges that I faced, you know, working alongside the undertakers as a researcher, but you know, being misrecognized as a part of the company by family members. So you know, I think it was important to approach that with a great deal of sensitivity, and part of what makes you know, ethnography both a rewarding but challenging endeavor is that you have to be you know, if people are allowing you into their lives during very difficult moments, it is important to be very empathetic and to follow their cues. So if I ever sensed that my presence was disruptive, I would just leave, because for me it was more important to respect the family and their mourning process than to be able to attend another funeral. But for the most part, my access was facilitated through the undertakers themselves, who, you know, basically just sort of brought me along with them and allowed me to participate, you know, in the work that they were doing. So I tried to be, you know, attentive and respectful, and at times, you know, I was participating also in the funeral prayers, and in a kind of a fully immersive way to try to experience what was happening in its fullest. But as you know, if you've been doing ethnographic work with the refugee deaths, it does take an emotional toll to be in these spaces. But I think the best way I have found to approach this issue is just by, you know, maintaining an open and empathetic attitude, and recognizing that the most important thing is not whether or not, you know, my research will move forward through access, but to recognize that what matters most is, you know, the experience of the families. So to be aware of my own position there, and if it seems disruptive, to not remain, to just simply leave. So that's how I would approach those, which did happen on a few occasions.
Thank you.
Christina?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this fascinating work. My question is about the medical aspect of this process, because as I'm working right now on Chechens in Europe, so I heard many times that for them, it becomes a quite important criteria if the body was modified. Let's say there were any injections of medical substance to conserve the body, etc. And even it does influence their decisions as for the itinerary, because these rules are not the same on all the states where the transfer for repatriation is done. So my question is, I'm thinking on that, and I'm asking myself, is it because of course they have the religious justification, but I'm not sure. So I would like to know if in your case, is there something like that?
Yes, so you're talking about kind of preservative agents to,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah. You know, typically this isn't something that Muslims would want to happen, but in certain cases, you know, it does happen, so that can create some challenges. I mean, I think what we see here is you know, maybe a conflict, or at least coming into some kind of clash, the kind of a medical or what constitutes a medical or biological necessity versus what is done as merely as part of like a funerary ritual or tradition. So modification of the body, I mean, this could be in some cases autopsies, right? If there's suspected foul play in the cause of death and the police investigator wishes to perform an autopsy, you know, even if the family protests this, it's a situation where the state can claim sovereign prerogative and say, we need to do this for the sake of, you know, security imperatives or so on, right? That there's this kind of criminal dimension. So there are situations where these different, let's say, logics come into contact with each other, and which logic trumps? You know, is it the kind of religious accommodation versus the kind of state sovereignty, right? In some cases, families don't have much of a choice because the prosecutor simply carries out what they are required to do, and usually it's the undertakers who have to try to massage this and justify it, and sometimes bear the brunt of the anger of the families as well. But there is a book I could recommend which discusses these issues, I think, quite eloquently. And it's by a legal scholar named Alison Rentlin, and I can put the title in the chat, or I can email it to you if you follow up with me. I'm blanking on the name of the title, but Alison Rentlin is the title, and she's very much writing about basically religious and cultural exceptions or ways in which the law comes into conflict with the last rites. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Right, thank you. Sid, did you still want to?
Yes, please. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I can.
Great. Thank you, Osman. And I could really, if you had the time to speak with you all day about all kinds of issues that you've raised in your very compelling presentation. But one of the things that has struck us with our work with last rites is, you know, as in life, as in death, there's an economics of death as well as a political and a cultural one. And being sort of English, white, Christian, Protestant even, the presumption in the UK where once your body is put in the ground, that's where it remains, has been really sort of shattered by the work that we've done. And we realise just how much the afterlife, your burial is often a very temporary thing. You may not stay where you are. In fact, you will not stay where you are unless your family can afford to carry on paying for you to remain there in many situations. But I'm also struck, whilst you've been talking about essentially people who are long settled in the countries that you've been focused on, obviously undocumented migrants and those who are recovered from deaths on migrant journeys don't have necessarily the settled networks in the countries that their body ends up in, and their families are at somewhat a huge disadvantage, not having planned obviously for death with mutual societies, etc. And so the economics of these situations, particularly where the state has control of the body, international law responsibilities for the body, moreover, seems to create a monopolistic economy, highly prejudicial to the interests of the families, where as the state will choose an undertaker, and the clock is ticking rather like an expensive taxi, as long as the body is in the state's care. And we've worked with families trying to find solutions to those problems, and we hope to deliver some kind of best practice guidelines through funeral directors networks this year. But my question really is, to what extent, beyond looking at the mutual societies, the sort of self-insurance schemes, etc., you looked at the economics of deaths in, as you say, minoritized communities?
Yes, thank you. Great question. And I would be happy to follow up the conversation at a later time too, Sid, if there's more that you'd like to chat about. I'd be happy to do that. I do write about this in the chapter on the undertakers and the bureaucracy of death. In the US, Jessica Mitford's book, The American Way of Death, really sort of blew apart the questions of the commodification of death and burial and the funeral industry. It was a bit sensationalist of a book, of course, but it really brought a lot of questions to the public light about economic practices in the funeral industry. I think another book that I found quite useful in thinking through was the sociologist Viviane Zellizer's of Morals and Markets, where she's talking about the kind of limits of what can be bought and sold, and the kind of different logics of commodification, and how certain religious ideals about sanctity sort of play into notions of what can be, where are the kind of more limits of markets. The way the economics of the funeral industry in Germany came up in my research was that, first of all, the Muslim undertakers thought that they were being, or they knew that they were charging far less for their funerals. They were not earning as much as, let's say, the more established German-owned, funeral homes that have been around for 100 years or more. So their prices were much lower than those competitors. And I have some interviews there where the undertakers are saying, well, when you have a funeral and you take it to one of these other companies, you'll get an itemized bill at the end of the procedures, and that the Germans will even charge you for the nails they used to seal the coffin, was how one of them put it. And they said they would laugh at our prices because they might charge 7, 8, 10,000 euros. Ours are 2,000 euros or something like this. So this was one element where they felt some economic pressure. But furthermore, within a kind of a highly segmented market for burials, where they were competing for business with other funeral providers focusing on Muslim burials, many of them mentioned some kind of market pressure, where every time there was a new firm that entered the market, they would try to cut prices as a competitive strategy, and it would, be sort of a collective harm to all the funeral entrepreneurs there. So they saw themselves in a structurally weaker position within the broader market for end-of-life services in Germany. And then within the segmented market, they had a lot of criticism for kind of price cutting measures as opposed to price gouging measures on the other hand. So I do address this quite a bit in the book, and there are some references there. There's a sociologist named Dominik Akyel who wrote a book in German about the economy of the German funeral industry. So I'd be happy to share some more references there too. But I think this is this is one of the big challenges for funeral markets, because there is this perennial image problem, right? If undertakers are seen as profiting off death, there's a lot of discursive maneuvering that goes on to try to avoid this kind of connection to their work. And so what I've seen in other context is, the utilization of a language of grief therapy, or not thinking about the pastoral work that the undertakers are providing as almost like a therapeutic or psychological service that they're offering to help families cope with loss and grieving. And so there are the kind of interjections of psychological elements in describing their work, which might be, one kind of reaction to charges of profiteering and price gouging. But the undertakers I spoke to were, in contrary to, there's always going to be sensationalist accounts in the newspaper, but I do want to underscore that the undertakers I spoke with were very, very thoughtful about these questions. And even though they may have had some criticisms for their competitors, they understood that this was a kind of a core dimension of their work was human relations, right? And so they were mindful of this when, in their interactions with clients and families and customers.
Thank you.
Thank you. So maybe just one last, we're running out of time, but I had I had many questions, but I'll, bring it down to one.
Okay.
Not so much speaking about the, the undertakers, because you've said quite a lot about the mediating role that you have, and everything that you have said was absolutely fascinating. I had another question about interpreters, and I know you've been doing some work as an interpreter as well, maybe not alongside the undertakers, but in the medical context, in hospital context. So I was curious to know, the kind of interactions you may have had with interpreters in the context of repatriation, reburial, burials, etc., and in your conversations also and actions with the undertakers as well. So how does that come into play, and what kind of, the kind of cultural mediation? They are absolutely crucial, and sometimes forgotten.
Yes.
Stage.
I'm glad you brought this up. I personally, I used to work as a medical interpreter in hospitals when I lived in New York. So this is work that I've done myself. It was, I didn't have, it was mostly, accompanying people to medical appointments and so on. And so I have firsthand experience of this work, and how it's not merely just about translating what someone says, but there's a whole host of kind of cultural mediation that happens, in the process of receiving medical care. This wasn't as central a part in the book. The hospital, the medical practitioners that I spoke to were by and large individuals who were involved in providing training for culturally sensitive end-of-life care. So these were, nurses or former nurses or medical professionals whose task was now to go around to hospitals and to lead clinics and workshops and trainings, right? To basically address specific issues. And this was not just for, they told me, they had minority communities within Germany, but that a lot of, foreign nationals might come to Germany to seek medical care as well, like private medical care. So this was kind of extended beyond the minorities in the country. And I think they do crucial work. I think this kind of pedagogical educational work is of vital importance. I think for many medical practitioners on the ground, I think many of them are very culturally sensitive to these issues too, but just may not simply have the experience or knowledge. Some of them, I do think it could be for them an extra set of burdens to remember all the differences in traditions. So I think this is why it's so crucial to have people in hospitals whose main role is to serve as a kind of facilitator, so that it's not the shift nurse or the doctor who's responding to an emergency situation that has to bear in mind some ideas about culture when they're trying to do life-saving interventions. But you're right that this is an area that deserves much more focus and attention. And I think one book that I was quite influential is, by Yasmin Gunaratnam, who wrote the book Death and the Migrant, where she did her ethnography of the hospice care in the UK. And I think there she does a nice job, speaking about all the different actors involved on site. And so that's one that I would turn to as another place to learn about these issues. But I do appreciate your question, Judith.
Yes, there is also a book entitled Les mots de la morgue.
Okay.
The words of the morgue, which is it's mostly situated in India.
Okay.
But again, it has a lot about interpretation, language, culture, and it's absolutely fascinating as well.
Okay.
I'm not sure whether it exists in English, but it's So we have to
Je vais
wrap up.
essayer en français. Je vais
Yeah,
essayer.
voilà. On va le dire. So thank you so much for the
Yes.
talk. It has been illuminating. It has been really fascinating. Thank you also for the questions also from the audience, and we'll be sure to put the webinar on the website so that it can be listened to by other people who couldn't be here with us. So thank you again, and we'll keep in touch, obviously.
Thank you for your generous invitation and your time and engagement and everybody's questions. And as I said, you can reach me by email here on the address here. Please feel free to follow up if you wish to continue the conversation. I'm really excited to learn about all the work that's being done on these issues and would love to continue to connect with other scholars and practitioners. So please be in touch, and to everyone, have a good rest of your day. Thank you, Judith.
Much.
Yes.
Talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye.